I've got 11 o'clock on my phone, so I'm going to make a start, everybody. So good morning and welcome to the Alliance for Sustainable Building Products latest webinar. So we're incredibly grateful as always to Jane Anderson for generously giving up her time to help us along our journey, because it is a journey on understanding environmental product declarations. These are complex documents and they can be a little bit overwhelming. And the idea of this event is that we're going to be equipped with what we need to understand and extract relevant information. So the program is I have a short introduction from myself, and then majority of the 1.5 hours will be with Jane. So Jane sits on numerous European committees, and she's an active ASBP board member. And we've got plenty of time, 20 minutes for question and answer session at the end. We will take questions as we go along. So you can put your questions into the Q&A. You can also upvote other people's questions if that's something similar to a sort of question you've got in your mind. We're not looking at the raise hand option. There are too many people, so we're not going to do it that way. So just put your questions in the Q&A, and then we'll either ask you to unmute and ask you to answer your question. Of course, we are recording this webinar, so if you don't want to be recorded, then we can ask it for you. But do keep your questions coming in, because it helps us know that you're there and you're taking notice of what you're doing. Otherwise, it's a little bit one-sided, this presenting, because we can't really see your faces. Feels like sometimes that we're talking to ourselves. So please keep your question and answers coming in. So just a quick reminder on the Alliance for Sustainable Building Products. So we're a not-for-profit organisation, so you can tell that from the price that we've charged our members for this event, which is nothing. So it's free to our members, and we've charged just a sort of nominal amount, really, just to encourage people to attend for the rest of the webinar. So we're a mission-driven organisation, and that's our mission: to accelerate the transformation to a healthy, low-carbon built environment by championing the use of demonstrable sustainable building products. So we know that buildings are made up of products, so it's really at the product level that where we have this focus. So hence the idea of looking at environmental product declarations as being, one way forward of working out what is a sustainable product and what isn't a sustainable product. So we've tried to sort of break down our work across these sort of 6 pillars. So the idea is that health and well-being is very much a part of the round, part of the whole conundrum of sustainability. And of course, it's just as important as resource efficiency, just as important as social value. So we need to look at these sort of 6 pillars pretty much in the same at the same time, with the same lens, really, and we're not allowed to forget one without another. So we launched in 2011 at the Palace of Westminster, and very auspicious occasion it was too. That's our chair, Gary Newman, there, looking either deep in thought or terrified, depending on who you talk to. We launched, we didn't really quite know what we were going to be doing, and we launched with just a few founder members in 2011, but we've managed to grow considerably through lockdown, and I think we're probably 85, nearly 90 members now, which is great. So we've taken on new staff, so welcome to Larry. So we've got quite an eclectic list of members, which is great because it's across the whole supply chain. So we've got leading architects like Cullinan Studios and Archetype, and then we've got specifiers, we've got contractors. So Mace have just joined as our part of our plastics group, and we've got product manufacturers. So whether that's Wienerberger or copper guys or clay plasters, paint people. And then we've got a range of trade bodies, academia, and so on. So it's a very broad church, and everybody has different needs, different requirements, different queries, different concerns. It's quite an interesting debate to sort of try and keep up to speed with everything. So on the team, there's a team of 6 staff now. So this gentleman on the left is Joe Giddings. He's just started with us this morning. So we've just had a welcoming session with him this morning. And then Catherine Adams leads on the sort of circular economy and technical side of things. Debbie is our influencer and looks after social media. Richard does most of the work, let's be frank. And Larry has come in to take some of the weight off Richard's shoulders. And then we have an experienced board from across the supply chain who help steer our work and keep us on track. We're very busy, so whether it's awards, whether it's our innovation pitch series, whether it's events and conferences like Healthy Buildings, we've just got a research project up and running, the Timber Accelerator Hub with Joe Giddings, so that's underway. We have a work stream that looks at reducing plastics in construction, another that looks at natural fiber insulation. We're specializing in whole life carbon, embodied carbon, sequestered carbon, hence this work with Jane and our EPD seminar today. And we've also been leading on circular economy and looking at reuse. So along with Timber Accelerator Hub, we have this Interreg project, which is quite nice to work with some French colleagues. So who says that we're out of Europe, really? So we're working with Nomady and a range of other French folk and looking at a sort of problematic waste stream, which is in this instance is duvets. So we've got a few up and coming Alliance for Sustainable Building Products events for your calendar. So you'll know that there's the Environmental Audit Committee has called for an inquiry into the sustainability of the built environment. And so that consultation is open now. I urge you to look at it and to respond to it. So we will be doing that. It's a very broad ranging inquiry and you know, it's not necessarily that we're going to respond to everything, but we're going to have this event that's going to be sort of discussing it in more detail. There are a number of different subsections that have been broken down to, so we'll look into that in a bit more detail and help you put in your submission. So we'll put a time on that. On the 10th of June, we've got an event with CIBSE on TM65, so looking at embodied carbon in building services, often overlooked and forgotten, but you'll find is a big chunk of the pie when it comes to embodied carbon. And then as part of Circular Economy Week London, we've got an event that's looking at metals and the circular economy, and there's some quite encouraging sort of stories to tell there about how the circular economy is working. And then sort of July time, we're not quite sure of a date yet. We're going to be looking at timber innovations and across Europe with Nature Plus, our colleagues in Germany. So we'll give you a bit more information. Sign up to our newsletter, of course, to be kept up to date. Tonight's going to be quite a long day because this evening ACAN, who do encourage and welcome membership from other people as well as architects. So I'm a chartered surveyor, so they've welcomed me into their midst. And so they've got their launch of their natural materials group this evening, which I'm looking forward to. And then we're a member of the Breathing City Future Urban Ventilation Network. So that's with Professor Catherine Oakes. And so they're doing really interesting events every couple of weeks on Tuesday lunchtime. So usually around sort of environmental issues, outdoor, indoor air quality, these types of things. So we're pleased to be part of that network. And then our colleagues in Germany, Nature Plus, the Eco Label, have got an exciting series of events, and the next one on the 30th of April is on bricks, so it's a European look at sort of brick development across the industry. So there's a range of other events coming up. So yeah, so do consider joining as a member and signing up to our newsletter. Obviously, we're looking for sponsors for events and research and inputs into our specialist groups, and keep an eye on our webinars. So thanks for signing up for this one. So that's the staff contact details. So do get in touch with us. We're a friendly bunch. We welcome your general comments and queries. So at that point, I am going to stop sharing and hand over to Jane, and in her capable hands, we'll spend the next hour and 20 minutes upskilling ourselves in the worlds of environmental product declarations. So thank you very much, Jane, as always, it must be said. Jane has been incredibly generous with her time, so we're ever grateful. So thank you, Jane.
No problem. Good morning, everybody. If anybody came to the Wood Knowledge Wales training event, some of this you may have seen before, in which case I apologise, but it kind of covers some of the same aspects. So today I'm going to try and explain basically what is in an EPD and how you can use the information, and where there are limitations in kind of using that information, the kind of things you need to be aware of. And I'm going to try to use the EPD that was sent round by Larry. So you can have a look at those at some point. I might ask some questions, but we'll try to sort of look at those EPD together. If you've got questions at any time, just come, just kind of ask them, and hopefully Richard and Simon will be checking the.
Yeah, we'll keep an eye on the Q&A,
yeah.
and so we'll probably interrupt you.
Yeah, no, please do.
I think that's a better way of doing it, isn't it?
Yeah, it's just hard for me to see what's going on.
Yeah, no, we'll keep an eye on that for sure.
No, that's fine. So just very quickly, hopefully most of you are familiar at least with what an EPD is, but in case you're not, it's basically a way of providing environmental information about a product in a standardized way, using something called life cycle assessment. So looking at the impact of the product over its whole life cycle, all the relevant impacts, and we use what we call product category rules as a way of making sure that it's done in a consistent way, so that you can actually start to use that information to make comparisons. So these terms, LCA, PCR and EPD, I'm afraid I'm going to use them, but that's basically what they are. And in terms of product category rules, for EPD generally, there is a standard called ISO 14025, which sets the rules for all product category for all EPDs, but it's really quite loose. So within that, if you did an EPD to 14025, you could really still decide how you wanted to assess your product. So because of that, we've developed the product category rules for construction products EPD, and that's been done in both Europe with European standards and internationally with ISO standards. So we have EN 15804, the first version, and then EN 15804 plus A2, which came out quite recently and which is starting to take over, and then this ISO standard. Effectively, the rules for all of these are very similar, so there shouldn't be really any particular reason that, at least if you're looking at global warming potential, so just embodied carbon and the kind of carbon impacts of products, these are reasonably interchangeable. The core kind of rules are the same. There are some differences between these two standards in terms of the indicators, and I'll talk about that. Yeah, other than that, there aren't real differences, and this one also makes quite a lot more information and detail mandatory. And then underneath that, we have what we call subcategory PCR. So these take the kind of overall construction product PCR and make even tighter rules for individual products about how to assess them. So they're kind of very specific. So at the moment, there are probably about 10 or 15 of these subcategory PCRs that have been developed to the first version of 15804. And these are currently being revised, and new ones are being developed to align to 15804 plus A2. And there are some being developed for the ISO standard, although that generally happens kind of outside of Europe. And yeah, just to say, although these are European standards, these are being used in North America, they are being used in Australia, New Zealand, in Asia. So just because it's a European standard, effectively they're still being used very, very widely. Yeah, South America, kind of, it's kind of the default standard. There are lots of EPD now available, so I've been tracking the numbers, and we're now up to just over 10,000 EPD. These are the number of EPD that actually published and kind of registered as kind of PDF documents. Some of these EPDs themselves cover lots of products, so there are a lot more products that are actually covered by EPD than just that 10,000. And then there are EPD tools that allow manufacturers to provide kind of specific data for a product on demand, so that there is lots more information than is actually even just shown by this. Yeah, so there are, for example, in North America, there are 1,000 EPD that cover 25,000 products. And in France, they've measured it, and you've got 1,300 EPD that cover 67,000 product lines. So there is quite a lot of data out there. We have got lots of briefing papers that we've produced with the ASBP. So if you've got more questions, have a look there. They cover kind of what EPD are, how to use them, where to find them. And then we have an online list of UK produced or EPD for UK produced products, which you might find useful. Okay, and just a quick overview. In terms of EPD programs, there tend to be EPD programs all kind of all over the world now. Across Europe, we have an organisation called Eco Platform that tries to ensure that all the programs have a high level of kind of checking of the data, that they make sure that the verifiers are well qualified, and that they're following the Eco Platform guidelines for verification, which are detailed and kind of go in excess of the standard in terms of their requirements. So Eco Platform is a good place to look, and they're now sort of moving to list all the EPDs that are produced by Eco Platform members. There are other program operators, and they're listed in one of the briefing papers. There's also data available through national databases, so generic data that isn't an EPD but is the kind of typical impact of those products. There's lots of digital resources now, and then trade associations provide EPDs through their own programs sometimes, and then manufacturers' websites as well. So are there any questions?
Well, we've had just a quick question in from Jenny. Mm-hmm. So Jenny was just making the point that Jenny works with Arston Timber. Mm-hmm. Jenny, Richard, maybe we can.
Yeah, I think we can.
Jenny to...
Oh, to unmute?
Yeah, and
Yeah.
maybe we can we see Jenny?
We can't see, but I thought we could perhaps do a poll.
Yeah, okay.
Question. Perhaps we can unmute Jenny in a bit during the Q&A.
Okay.
Okay.
Ooh, okay. Sorry. All right. So, what information is included in an EPD? Yeah. So the thing is, the EPDs from different programs, they all look completely different. They're sometimes the information that they provide is in a different order and maybe kind of formatted completely differently, but they all have a common content that's set by the product category rules. You kind of start to get familiar with where they keep that information depending on the EPD program, but they should all have this information that I'm going to kind of run through somewhere in the EPD. So kind of breaking it down into 4 types of groups. The first kind of information or set of information is about the kind of the company and the EPD itself. So you should always know who it is that's providing the EPD. That might be a company, it might be a trade association, for example, that covers a broader group of companies. There will always generally be an EPD number, and it will always have a validity. So the standards set a 5-year validity, so that should always be given. Sometimes it might be shorter, for example, if it's a new product and they've only used, for example, 6 months of data to produce the EPD, then the program might give it a shorter validity so that they have time to collect more data and to do a kind of EPD based on a year of data, which is the requirement normally. And then it should have information on the verification, who's actually has somebody verified it and checked that it follows the standards and that the information is plausible. The second lot of information is about the product that's actually been assessed, and that should describe the product. Ideally, it will provide some technical information, maybe a picture of the product so that you can double check it's what you're thinking of. Then it should provide a description of how it's been made and what it's made of. It should provide information on any biogenic carbon content if it's a product that uses natural, what kind of bio-based materials, and also it should describe the packaging. The other thing that it will also tell you is, and it kind of comes down here, I've got it here in the LCA modelling, it will tell you the product category rules that have been used. So it'll tell you, an EPD must tell you whether it's using 15804A1 or A2 or ISO 21930, or maybe just ISO 14025. The program operators, as I say, they also have their own kind of interpretation of 15804, and they provide more detailed rules if they've got set rules to approach it. So that will also be listed, and then they also sometimes have they'll adopt these subcategory product rules, so they'll use those and say that as well, or they might have their own product category rules that give further rules for particular types of product. And this is all to try and make sure that there's consistency when you're looking at particular products. They should tell you who's undertaken the EPD, who's produced it. That might be an LCA practitioner, or it might be the company, and what tool and database they've used, so that you can kind of check that. Very important, what we call the declared unit, sometimes the functional unit if it's a particular type of EPD that covers the whole life cycle. That isn't as common. and that will be whether the data is provided, for example, for a meter cubed of product, or a ton, or a kilogram of product, or some other, maybe a meter length of pipe work. So, and that's a really important piece of information. So if you imagine you've got one EPD for a ton of product and one for a kilogram, you kind of expect the results are going to be 1,000 times different. So you really need to make sure you know what that's for. And it's also important for how you use the information, because you've got to convert the data that's given for the declared unit to what you're using in your building. It will tell you which modules have been assessed, and I'll explain that, and it will describe the way it's addressing the modules beyond the factory gate, so how it's actually modelling those, and I'll talk about that. And then it tells you the impacts using environmental indicators, what we call core impact indicators, resource indicators, waste and output indicators, and I'll cover those. I can see there are some questions. Do you want
we've got a couple of questions, Jane, come in. So we'll have a pause there. Richard, I think, so Timor, morning, guys. I've got a quick question. So can we unmute them?
I've been muted. Let's just see if they're they have a mic. If not, we can perhaps ask it for them.
Sure, brilliant.
Okay. Can you see this one, Jane? Perhaps do you want to read it out yourself? Is that easiest?
Okay, sorry. Could you say anything about EPDs and their visibility on systems like the NBS? I can't say anything about the NBS, actually, I'm afraid. But I don't know. I know that the NBS are aware of EPDs. Hopefully now that lots more of them are available digitally, that's going to be something that will improve. But yeah, I don't know. I mean,
just remind us, NBS, what that stands for, and who runs
it's
that?
National Building Specification. It's it used to be owned by RABA, but it's now a kind of independent organisation. But it's a way of it kind of provides default specification and kind of tools. It would certainly be good if it linked, and that would enable you to specify on the basis of information in the EPD. But I'm afraid I don't know. But I have talked to them, and I know that they do know about kind of embodied carbon, and we're looking at it. Hopefully it will come in if it isn't there already. The waste indicators, can I do that
if you're coming
when
to
we
that.
get there, if that's
absolutely.
okay, because I've got a bit on that. Okay. When we look at some EPDs. All right.
Brilliant. Thanks, Jane. Thanks, everyone.
No, that's fine. Okay. There we go. So these are the modules, the life cycle modules that we're talking about. They're broken down into kind of what we call stages. So the product stage. So this is mandatory for all EPD. They always have to provide the information on manufacturing, and that goes all the way back to the boundary with either nature, or if you're using recovered recycled material or energy, to when it kind of stops being a waste and starts being a product. That's the boundary that's used. The construction phase, so getting it to the site and the impact of using it on site, the wastage and any installation processes. The use stage, quite often this isn't, well, you have use here, this is impact emissions that come from the product. So that would be where you would report, for example, if your product is off-gassing, or has a kind of carbonation during the use stage for concrete, for example, that's there. If it needs maintenance, so floor coverings or windows that need painting, you'd normally have an allowance, for example, for repair for windows that might take account of broken glass if it was in a particularly problematic environment, for example. And then replacement and refurbishment, then these generally in a product EPD, you don't see these because the product just covers one life cycle. The EPD just covers one life cycle. But when you assess it at the building level, then you would use all this information to model the refurbishment that happens. And then we have the end of life, so the impact of what happens to the product when you dispose of it. And then this module D, which shows the benefit of material that becomes available for recycling. If it isn't, it's only, module D only shows what we call the net output or input. So if you use recycled material, if for example it's a recycled steel product, then when you come to the end of life, even though you recycle it, you kind of loop that recycling back, and you don't have an output of recycled material that you look at in module D. Indeed, you actually have less recycled material than you started with, and so module D can actually show a disbenefit, particularly when you're using recycled materials. So you do need to be aware with module D, and I'll kind of show you that you don't look at it, if you're looking at a circular economy, you don't just look at module D, you need to look at the whole EPD, and this gives you some information about the circular economy, but you need to take it into account the actual product itself as well. So a virgin product will have a really good module D, but a recycled product will have a really bad module D. But actually the benefit of recycling a recycled steel and a virgin steel, it's exactly the same. They both stop you using virgin steel. So that's why I don't like module D, and that's why you need to be very careful when you use it. In terms of embodied carbon and kind of how this links, when we talk about upfront carbon, we're just talking about all the stages up until you kind of finished the building. So it's the impact that happens upfront when you build the building. Then we have embodied carbon, which is the whole life cycle of the product using these kind of system boundaries. And then we have whole life carbon, which takes into account operational carbon as well. But you also should be assessing this module D, so you have this information and you can take it into account. But it isn't actually part of these figures. The other thing that you should just be aware of is when we look at upfront carbon for things like timber, there's normally a big benefit in the assessment of these modules in A1 to A3 for timber and other natural kind of bio-based products because of the carbon that they sequester, which will then be released here at the end of life. So within your upfront carbon, we don't include the biogenic carbon. So we don't show that benefit because we're not showing this benefit that happens at the end of life. So it's not included in upfront carbon, but it is included in embodied carbon assessments and whole life carbon assessments. Okay, are there any more questions?
There's one from an anonymous attendee, Jane. Can you see that one?
Would we divide the upfront carbon calculation by the lifetime of the building? Generally, no. So for upfront carbon, if you like, it's a one-off, and it's for the construction of the building. So it's normally reported per metre squared of gross internal area of the building, so that you kind of have a metric. I've not seen it ever divided by the life cycle. For embodied carbon and whole life carbon, certainly in some places they do then divide that by the years of life. So you would see a figure that would be provided per metre squared per year. But in the UK, we tend to just do it per metre squared for all of these. In France, they do it per metre squared per year, but I mean, you can do it. There's no reason why you can't do it. But in the UK, certainly it's more common that we just provide the total per metre squared as the figure that you would talk about. Okay.
I've got a couple of quick questions have come in, Jane. So, so one from Timor, so I'll read it out loud. Lime reabsorbs CO2 as it cures. How might this impact the EPD? So, interesting question.
So when I talked here about carbonation in the use stage here for concrete, lime is another example. In fact, lime generally carbonates really, really quickly. So this is when you make a product with lime, you're basically, when you make it, you're using lots of energy to heat it up and drive off the CO2 to give you calcium oxide, which is the kind of the active kind of bit of lime. When you then make it into a product, it reabsorbs that CO2, so it converts back into calcium carbonate. But you've still got that emission of CO2 from the energy that you've used. But it will absorb almost all that CO2 back into the product. And actually, because it's so quick, then we normally, I mean, I think it happens within weeks.
Really?
Of the construction process. So we actually, for lime, it would be included in this construction phase. It's different for concrete. It's a very, very slow process with concrete. So the kind of way of thinking about it, with reinforced concrete, you have a 5 centimetre cover to make sure that effectively that when concrete carbonates, it becomes more porous and it allows water to come in, and that when it hits the reinforcement, then the reinforcement rusts and it expands and cracks the concrete. So that's a big problem. So that's why you have that 5 centimetre kind of cover, and it's expected that it would take kind of 50 to 100 years at least to carbonate. So it's a very, very slow process. So that's why we have this in concrete. It will be done in the use stage, and some products like a block, a kind of quite porous block, it might carbonate the whole product, but most, like reinforced concrete, it would be a very small proportion that would carbonate in B1, and we can have a look at that. I think it's covered in one of the EPDs that we've got, and then you'll actually get more carbonation when you crush it here in C1. So when you crush it, you get more surface area and it's out in the open and it's exposed, so it will actually carbonate some more in this stage as well. Does that help?
Yeah, thanks. I think that answers the questions. We've got a couple of more.
Okay.
Couple more here. So Nicola de Quincy was wondering whether we could go through this diagram that we have there using a timber beam as an example, which I think is quite a nice sort of exercise.
Okay.
Can we do that?
Yeah, so for a timber beam, basically in A1, this is the forestry. So the impacts in A1 would be the impacts of planting trees, planting trees. If you actually go out and do that, if it's not a naturally kind of generated forest, it would encounter the processes of things like thinning, and kind of every 20 years they tend to go in and kind of reduce the number of trees until you get the sort of suitable spacing. So that kind of forestry management process. And it will also include the harvesting, so actually cutting down the trees after kind of 50, 60 years, the kind of energy of doing that. A2 would then be the transport of that timber, the log, to the sawmill, and then everything that happens in the sawmill will be here in A3. So that will be the cutting up of the timber and the energy that is used to kiln dry the timber, for example. Then A4 here is the transport to the construction site, and A5, so if you imagine when it comes onto site, then they cut it down and they waste 10% of all the wood that comes on site. So what happens here, if you need let's say a meter cubed of timber on your site, then you would have the impact of 1 meter cubed here. That's what's included in this. Then the wastage, 10%, you basically need 10% more product to make the waste, and then you dispose of it. So the impact here is of an additional 10% of all of this impact. So the manufacturing the product and transporting it to site is included here, plus the impact of disposing of that waste that you've made. The timber beam, you don't expect to have to do any of this for a timber beam. The idea is that it's kind of, you know, above your ceiling, below your floor, you don't touch it. So then you've just got the end of life. So that would be the impact of actually basically kind of deconstructing, demolishing your building, transporting the timber to a waste processing site, a kind of recycler, or a kind of yard. Timber commonly now it's either chipped and used for energy, or it is taken and chipped and used to make particle boards. So effectively the impact in C3 generally is kind of chipping, and then some of it might get disposed of. That's very some of it is incinerated without energy recovery or with very low amounts of energy recovery. So that would be covered in here. And then in module D, you would show the benefit effectively of any energy recovery that does happen if you're using it for energy here, or of not having to use virgin timber chips if you're putting it into chipboard, or of not using kind of virgin timber chips if you're making it into a kind of biofuel. And if you reuse the timber, then there's kind of no impacts here. It kind of becomes available here. And then you would show the benefit of not making a new timber beam here. Does that make it clear?
I would say it's reasonably clear. When you say clear.
We will look at some.
Nicola, I don't know, do you have a microphone? Richard, can we maybe unmute?
Yeah, that was really great. Thank you so much. Brilliant.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, so
really helped
does
me.
Does that not mean you have more questions? No.
No more questions at the minute. No, thanks.
Okay. All right. Thanks, Nicola.
I think we are going to have to hurry on, I'm afraid. Sorry.
Okay. All right. I've got a couple of questions from Rabina here.
Okay.
But, we'll come to them. She's a bit confused about module D, which is
Can we
reasonable, I think, but we'll come on to them. Yeah.
Otherwise, well, we're not going to. It's going to take too long, I'm afraid. It's all right. So just in terms of impacts, these are the core impacts that are in both versions of 15804 and also in 21930, and these are the additional impacts that are now measured in the new version of 15802. The other thing, 15804, the thing to know is though that these indicators, certainly the bottom one, well, not all of them actually, but quite a few of them are measured using a different indicator now, so you can't compare them, but you can compare the GWP. So embodied carbon will be the same. And yeah, this is just looking at an EPD for 15804. And when you look down here, the big difference, you need to provide much more detail now about your global warming potential and break it down into fossil, biogenic, and land, what we call land use and land use transformation. So the impact of changing any changes in land use. And you can see here, for example, this is a timber product, so it's actually showing you the benefit of your biogenic carbon impact here, the storage, so that's why it's negative here. and then you've got the fossil and land use. And you can see here that these indicators for acidification, it's a different unit. The eutrophication is broken into 3, and that's a different unit as well. So yeah, that makes it a bit more difficult if you're doing kind of life cycle assessment. But in terms of embodied carbon, this total is the same as you would get in this EPD. Okay. Just in terms of reading an EPD, they quite often, if we go back, you'll see here they say kind of 1.41 e to the -5. Basically, that is, if you look at these, it's a way of providing information about the number in a more concise way. So that there would be lots of noughts to provide a number times 10 to the -5, and that makes it very long, and that takes up too much space. So EPDs do tend to use this scientific notation, so you just need to be aware of it. So basically, if this was the actual result that you got, you should always really be providing it, or they should always be providing it to 3 significant figures. And then in scientific notation, that's times, if it's 0.1, it's times 10 to the -1. And you can kind of think of it as the number of times that you've kind of jumped your decimal point. So this one, you go 1, 2, 3. So it's, sorry.
Yeah.
It's 10 to the 3. Okay.
Okay.
Yeah. The indicators here, this breaks down the type of energy that's being used, and secondary fuels, the amount of water that's being used, and the amount of secondary material that's being used, so the amount of recycled material. This isn't a straight recycled content, because you need to actually compare that to the total amount of material that's being used to give your recycled content, and you don't have that. So but that gives you an indication at least of recycled content, and it may also tell you that. The waste indicators, I think somebody had a question. So these, it breaks down the waste that happens through the whole kind of supply chain. So if you go back in A3, that would be your manufacturing waste that has been disposed of, effectively that hasn't been recycled. If it's been recycled, it will be measured here. So if it goes to landfill or incineration, then it will be in this indicator unless it's hazardous. If it's recycled, it would be here, or if it's gone to energy recovery, then it would be here, or if it's been reused, if it's your own waste. So that's the way that the indicators work. These are the different indicators that kind of cover energy. There is one that tells you how much energy is kind of in the product. So for plastics, that would be the primary energy non-renewable, and for something like timber, it's the primary energy renewable, and it's basically calculated as the kind of energy content of the product, the amount of energy you get if you burn it. You've got the other measure of the energy that's being used to make it, and then there's a separate one here that covers primary energy just from fossil fuels. So non-renewable also includes what's it called, nuclear energy. Yeah, and that's just a table. So you'll have these slides and you can have a look, but it just tells you where different energy comes from. So we've got 3 EPD. I'm just thinking how much time we've got. 20 minutes. I might just, I don't know that we've got time to actually
Well, let's just see how we get on.
Yeah.
We can go into the Q&A maybe, Jane.
Yeah, okay. So how to do this quickly. If I stop sharing this and go to my screen. So do you see an EPD now?
We do, yeah.
Oh, that worked. Fantastic. So this is an EPD for a thermalite block.
Yep.
Okay, so I'll do it with this one. So you can see this EPD, this is the number of the EPD. This was the first EPD that came from the BRE program to 15804. This is the manufacturer, so Forterra, and it tells you there the standard that it's using.
Okay.
It tells you what the product is, and it gives you the name of the company address.
Okay.
Okay. And there's a picture of the product so that you know that's what it looks like. That's quite useful with products that are in foreign languages. Sometimes you can just quickly go, oh yeah, that does look like what I'm looking for. This gives you the validity. So this one is 5 years, but it got updated for some reason. The company might have changed its name, I think.
Okay.
And yeah, there you go.
Yep.
And this is the verification. So this is used a company, it's an external verifier. So it's somebody that doesn't work for Forterra.
Yep.
They do actually work for the LCA consultant, but heck, it's one of my problems.
Yes, it's a bit close, isn't it?
But it has been verified, basically. It tells you here it's for a ton of the product. So all these results are going to be for a ton, and it covers 2 sites. And it's what we call a cradle to gate with options EPD. So it tells you the impact of manufacturing it and disposing of it in C4. So it's not going to show you recycling from it, or at least based on what it says here. And it shows you the benefits in module D. So possibly there's a mistake here, because you shouldn't have a benefit in module D if you've not recycled it. But we'll discuss that.
Okay.
So that's the information about the program operator, and it tells you that it's based on their product category rules that relate to 15804A1. All EPDs have this statement, and basically it says you shouldn't be able to use the data for comparison if you're not comparing it to 15804 EPD.
Okay.
At the time it was written, there was only 15804A1. Now there is 15804A2. So you would be able to compare, as I said, the GWP, but not maybe the other indicator. Well, you can't compare the other indicators if they're using different units, because they don't correlate. It tells you about the product, what it's used for, and what is some technical information, which is useful, and then what it's made of, which can help you sometimes if you're trying to work out why it is that one product, it looks a lot better than another. For example, you could go and have a look at here and go, this product doesn't use as much cement as the one that I'm using, and cement is a big impact, so that might explain it. It tells you about how they're manufactured. There's not very much information here, but I think there might be a picture that shows you very tiny wording, so you can't read it, but kind of nice, complicated process.
What does PFA stand for, Jane?
Pulverized fuel ash. So it's what comes from
content,
power stations that it acts like cement. But it's a byproduct of electricity, coal-fired electricity. So you've got here, it's 1 ton of thermalite block, and then it tells you the boundaries. It tells you where it got the data. So it tells you that it collected the data for the Forterra site in 2011. So quite a long time ago. And I think if we go back here, this EPD actually expired in 2019. So because this data is quite old. I've used it because it's got lots of information in it, basically. And then it also tells you that it used SEMA Pro and EcoInvent 2.2. So now EcoInvent is at like 3.7, I think. So the data is updated. So again, this is another reason why it's no longer valid. Although generally things have got better over time. So it's kind of not such an issue to use an older EPD if you can't find anything else.
Okay, yeah.
So this EPD does aggregate, so it doesn't actually, you don't have to break down A1, A2, A3 and show the individual impacts. You can aggregate it and just show it as one collective impact for the whole kind of cradle to gate. It is here saying C4 disposal. Yeah, but this figure here, so 280 kilograms of CO2, this would be the figure that you would use for your upfront embodied carbon or your cradle to gate embodied carbon if you were using it in a building level assessment. And you would have to generate your own data for getting it to site and wastage, because it doesn't tell you. You can see here, for example, that most of the energy that they use is primary energy, non-renewable energy. So they're using a small amount, and that probably comes from the electricity. It's just the renewable and the grid mix, probably. And they've got for one, this was for one, what was it, a ton of product, I think.
Yep.
Then, so they're using 211 kilograms of secondary material, waste material.
Okay.
And they produce a very small amount of waste, most of which is hazardous. But they do produce 101 kilograms of waste that is reused. So I think that's they basically make the kind of waste blocks. They sell those, and they're used as a lightweight aggregate, as they are, if I remember rightly. Yeah, so here they're actually saying that 90% of it is recycled, so that actually should go into C3, because C3 is recycling and recovery, and this 10% that's landfilled should be in C4. So I might send a letter, but the EPD is expired, so it's not really relevant. Yeah, and then they do tell you here a little bit about where the impacts come from. Most of it is from the use of cement and quicklime. Yeah, so there you go. And the benefit is because they don't have to use because they can use the recycled block as an aggregate. So that's the benefit, but it's small because aggregate has a very low impact. So that's just running through the EPD. And if we look at another one, for example, very quickly, sorry, this one is for an Irish aircrete block, so the same
similar
product.
thing.
This one is just for a kilogram. So you'll need to, when you look at these results, you need to remember that this one you need to multiply by 1,000 to get, so that you can make a comparison of them. Or the alternative is because you actually, well, let's say the better way of doing it, because most times when you're using block, you're actually you're making a wall that's 100 mil thick, for example. So it's actually the density. You need a particular volume of the product to actually make the comparison. So that in that case, you need to go back and look at the density of the products that it gives you, so that you would actually get the same. Use the density to give you the volume of the product that you'll be using. The other thing to take into account, because these are aircrete blocks and they have thermal performance, they give you some insulation, is that you do need to take that into consideration. So making a straight comparison with these products without looking at the thermal performance would give you maybe the wrong answer, because if you just did it and said, oh, this one is better, but actually you would lose more heat with it,
Yeah.
then over the lifetime of the product, building, it's not probably a good idea. Or you'd need to take into account the additional amount of insulation you would need to give
Okay.
the same thermal performance. So yeah. This one uses a more recent version of EcoInvent, you can see, and it's also been verified by me. So it's super duper. But this one just provides you the cradle to gate, so there's no more information. And as you can see, it's got the same sort of information. It's got a different type of picture, and then you go straight into the results. But this one does, for example, break down A1 to A3 and give you that information.
Okay.
But then it doesn't give you this. Okay, so that is, I think, all you need to kind of see here. And then there is another one, sorry, which is this one, which is a German one, which is the typical UK product from the Trade Association. So this tells you how many the member associations produced it. So it's their average. And this one is done for a metre cubed. So this one will be for 600 kilograms of the product for a metre cubed, weighing 600 kilograms. So that's basically how you can
compare.
Kind of compare.
Start to compare anyway.
Yeah. Are there any questions? I'm just.
We've got a few questions, but we can leave them to the end, I think.
Okay. All right. Sorry. Thank you. Right. Let's go back to the slides. Sorry. It's yeah. So they should always provide verification information. Yeah, this just sort of shows you that different dates, validity, when the data is. So just kind of, it's worth looking and knowing how recent the data is. You can see here that they've all used different, that they've got different information about how much.
Can you make the slides a bit bigger, Jane? Can you put it on?
Yeah, sorry, no, I'm
on back onto.
There you go. Yeah, sorry.
Thanks, Steve.
Yeah. But yeah, you can see here that they've got different units, so you need to do it. They do tell you, both of these, that you can use a scaling factor. So if you're using a product with a different density, then you would basically scale it by use of the product mass. If that makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry. So this is showing you the results for the different, based on the indicators that they've actually used. And so, yeah, you can see there's a big difference here between these two, because one's for a kilogram and one's for 1,000, and then this is for 600 kilograms. Here I've done it all for 1,000 kilograms.
Yeah.
And you can actually see on that basis for the mass that the British Precast and the Forterra are very similar.
Yeah.
And that the Manoc is different. And just sort of looking at what you can see from the British Precast, which does lots of the different modules, the impact of transport kind of really quite small in comparison to the impact of the product.
Yeah, interesting.
So just starting to see that, and then the waste small. And you can see that the British Precast one, it uses a much higher proportion of secondary materials than the Forterra did one per ton. Just a very quick thing, we won't do this as a quiz, but effectively, just because a product has an EPD, you do need to remember that it doesn't mean it's a good product. All the EPD does is tell you what the impact of the product is. Then you have to look at it to understand whether or not it's a good product. EPDs should always be verified by somebody independent, and if they're not verified, then you really shouldn't regard them as an EPD. and you should encourage whoever it is to get their EPD verified. I mean, I verify EPDs, and it's very common to find mistakes that have been made, and people that have misinterpreted or misunderstood. So the verification process is really important.
Vital. Yeah.
You should not use all the information provided in an EPD. So if we go back here, if, for example, you're using your product and it comes from 800 kilometers away, then you shouldn't use the 6. You should use 60. That makes sense.
Yeah.
And if it's coming by boat, this is by road. If it's coming by boat, then you're going to have to calculate it yourself. If you know on your site you're going to have a different wastage because your contractor measures their waste and they can show you that they typically have a wastage rate that's very, very low, then you can adapt that, for example, if it provides you with the waste based on that. For example, at the end of life, if you've designed your building for deconstruction, for example, and it's a product that makes a big difference, then you can change that information. But if you've done kind of nothing, then you should basically use the typical impacts. Just finally, EPD are very expensive. Not necessarily, some are, but there are much cheaper ways now of getting EPDs using EPD tools. But that's really for another day. Very quickly on biogenic carbon. So this is the carbon that comes from biomass, and the reason we kind of look at it differently is because in bio-based products they have sucked up carbon from the atmosphere to actually kind of make the biomass. So either that's because it's plant-based and it's absorbing CO2 or taking CO2 in through photosynthesis, or for something like wool, the sheep is eating the grass which has done that, and then it's using that biogenic carbon to make the wool. So we're taking into account both the uptake of that CO2 and then the storage of it, and then the release of that CO2 at the end of life. And those two things generally balance, the uptake and the release. So we show it in the EPD as the uptake in A1 and then the release when that happens in A5 or in module C. But we show it, or we consider it differently in that way from the fossil, and that's why in the new version it's shown as a separate line and then as part of the total, and that's why in upfront carbon we don't include it. So yeah, the sequestered carbon is the carbon that's been removed and stored in the product. Hopefully that's done it. In terms of measuring it, there is a standard that tells you how to do it for wood. You calculate the actual carbon content of the product, or the bio-based bit of the product, and then you kind of you can do that by looking at the kind of chemical formulas of it. And for wood, you need to take out the kind of the mass of water that's in the product, and also the things like adhesives. If you've got glulam, there's a kind of horrible formula, but effectively for timber, half of the dry mass of timber is carbon. So you need to, from the information about the product, it will normally tell you what's in it, so you can, and then it will tell you the moisture content, so you can take out the moisture content and the adhesives. Then you get the dry mass of the timber. The mass of CO2 is 44 grams and the mass of carbon is 12. So you can use that to convert to CO2, and that's how you calculate your sequestered carbon. We could look now. I stop very quickly. If we look at this is a Danish glulam EPD.
Okay.
See that?
Yeah.
So we're looking at loads of different EPDs, as you can see, formatted differently, but it's still got this text on comparability. It's got the validity here, tells you the manufacturer.
Okay.
If we look, so this one is just doing A1, it's got the transport, and then it's got the end of life, module D.
Okay.
We'll have a quick look. This one tells you that for the product, it's basically 86% dry wood, 12% moisture, 2% adhesive. So that gives us our dry mass of the wood. It should tell us somewhere that it's got a density. So it's for 1 meter cubed with a density of 500.
Okay.
So we know 86% of that is the dry mass of the timber. We go, these are the descriptions of all the things, and just this one tells you that it's actually providing 2 scenarios, one for incineration with energy recovery and the other for recycling into particle board. And then it shows you the benefits of that. If we go here, if we do our, just hoping this will work. So we knew it's 500 kilograms is in the meter cube times 0.86, because that's, so this is the mass of the dry timber. We divide it by 2. So this is the carbon content, and then we times it by 44 divided by 12. So 1 meter cubed of this glulam has 788 kilograms of CO2 stored into it. So that amount of CO2 has come out of the atmosphere and is now in the product, not in the atmosphere. So that's a benefit all the time that we're using that product before it gets released. And if we then go back to the EPD here, then you can see that it says the fossil impact here is 119 kilograms. And so if I go here and times -1, so this is a it's not doing it, times -1. Oh, never mind. I hate
this. This is it's like, you know, playing with pets and animals on live TV, isn't it?
Yeah. Anyway, so -788. Hopefully that, if I now plus 119, get to 669. So it's got that benefit, and then we're adding on the impact from using the fossil fuels to make it, and hopefully when we look at the EPD, it's nearly the same amount. I'm not sure what I've done wrong, something. But yeah, so that's a bit weird. Anyway, and then at the end of life here, you can see it's got these 2, so one here for incineration and one here for recycling. In both of these, you can see there is an emission that's more or less the same, a little bit more for incineration, because they, I'm not sure why actually, but I think they use a bit of energy to actually get it to kind of burn in incinerators quite often. And that is quite similar to the amount of carbon that we calculated. Should actually be the same. And then the benefit here in module D, basically when you recycle it, you don't need the same amount of wood, so it's showing a big benefit. And then in Denmark, their energy is not very carbon intensive, because they use lots of biomass and
Lots of
renewables.
biomass and wind,
So there's a lower benefit. So it is actually better to recycle it than to use incineration. In a lot of UK EPDs, it's the opposite. Although now, because of the benefits of using lots more renewables in our electricity, it has actually moved. It is now better to recycle timber than to use it for energy recovery. So that's good. Sorry, I've done that a bit quickly, but so yeah, at the end of life, if you reuse timber, you basically always have to transfer the benefit of this, that the carbon that's stored in the timber. You either, if it is released to the atmosphere because you burn it, then you need to put it in as a release and an emission. But if you are recycling it or reusing it, you still need to transfer it to the next, to that recycled product, so it still has that benefit, which means that you have to put it into your system as if so that it balances, and otherwise everybody be kind of double counting that benefit. So
Make this full screen, Jane. Sorry.
Oh, sorry, I keep forgetting to do that. Thank you. Yeah, and if it goes to landfill, then you should look at how much, if it produces methane and what happens to that methane, and the latest version of 15804 requires that if there's any carbon still stored in the landfill, so if it hasn't decayed, you have to transfer that to nature. So you always end up with a carbon balance now. Yeah, it just, there's now much more requirement in the new version of 15804 for when they do the LCA, that they have to really show exactly how they've tracked carbon. So hopefully we will get much clearer results in the EPD, and there's quite often errors with biogenic carbon, so hopefully we'll get less of that. This is an EPD actually from Australia, and that's kind of really helpful in explaining exactly what happens and where it happens. So that's the sequestration. These are all the impacts from the use of kind of fuel, diesel in the forest, taking it to the sawmill, the actual sawmill, the kiln drying, which tends to be the biggest impact. A lot of the time they're using waste timber from the kind of sawmill to actually fire the kiln drying. And that timber is, that energy is basically carbon neutral, apart from this impact here from kind of growing it and getting it to the site. But yeah, so with timber, the more timber that they're actually using to produce the product, and the less fossil fuels, that's how they can most reduce their impacts. And then you can see here the difference in the different processes, and you've got here in Australia that their energy tends to be pretty bad, I'm afraid, still using quite a lot of coal. So there's a big benefit from using the timber, the waste timber, for energy recovery, and not so much from recycling. But
interesting.
you know, you just need to, you need to be careful when you look at other EPDs, because that isn't going to be appropriate now for the UK, for example. Right. I think this, I'm sorry, but the EPD should always tell you what happens in the scenarios, and just, if you're using EPD, you need to kind of check, if you've got a really heavy cladding and a light cladding, then that's probably going to affect the amount of foundations and structure that you need. So you kind of don't always just make a straight comparison between products. Again, if they with the, as we explained for the aircrete, if it affects the thermal performance of the building or the amount of thermal mass, something like that, then you really need to do it at the building level, taking into account that the way that those products work, not just the product level. You need to always check the declared units, and you might need to adapt the data so that you can get those so that they match. And you need to look at the life cycle. So you shouldn't compare products if they've got different scenarios at the end of life, unless that makes sense. So when we say equivalent, you could compare, if it was what typically happens in the UK, you could compare it if it's different. For example, you were comparing brick with brickwork and blockwork, then they might have, they might assume different things. You reuse some of the brick, for example. You might not reuse the block, but and if they need different ancillary materials, so for example, bricks and blocks need different amounts of mortar per metre squared, so you need to think that through. You can't just compare a brick with a block.
Yeah.
So sorry, it's been a bit of a rush through there, but hopefully that kind of gives you an overview.
Yeah, no,
I can stay a bit later if there are lots of questions.
Okay. So we've got a few questions coming in. So Richard, should we sort of work through the open ones? Does that make sense?
Yeah, of course. Which one shall we start
So
with?
start with Sanko, who was at the top of.
Okay.
Then we'll have to read out the team all line. So Sanko, we'll start with Sanko. So CIBSI TM65. We've got an event on that, but yeah, maybe you can.
I'm not sure if Sanko's mic's working. Jane, do you want to?
Okay.
So
yeah, so basically TM65, where there aren't a lot of EPD for building services products, although there's quite a lot, for example, in the French system, and there are some. So TM65 does tell you what is there and where to look for it.
Okay.
And you should ask. I think basically TM65 is trying to, where there isn't information, it's trying to get a less onerous way for manufacturers to at least give you some information, so you have something to use that's better than nothing. And from that point of view, it's good, and hopefully they're collating all that information, and it will, and they, you know, the industry will be encouraged to do EPDs. So I think it would be better if they did EPDs than, but it's a good initiative.
It's coming, yeah. Okay, so a couple of questions from Timor. So first one was sort of, you know, future EPDs become digital. So I suppose like a sort of passport rather than a PDF, which makes sense, doesn't it?
Yeah. So that's really strong, and now all the eco platform members have signed up that all future EPDs will be made available digitally, and the eco platform has a portal where that will be available, and they've got APIs so that tool producers can link up to that. And there's I'm working on an ISO standard that will cover that. So yes, definitely.
All right, brilliant.
And also potentially more what we call parameterized EPDs. So it makes it much easier where you've got products that vary in size and density and things like that to kind of provide that information more easily.
Okay, so we've got a question from Mark.
People talk about blockchain, but no, I don't know.
No, I don't know either. So sounds like Steve doesn't know either. He's just showing off. So Mark Warner, if an EPD has modules not declared, is it really of any use? Is it really valid?
Yes, no, it's definitely valid. It just hasn't given you any information about the modules that happen beyond the factory gate or for individual modules. That might be because nothing happens. So, for example, if the product doesn't need any maintenance, it won't declare B2. The other issue is that, you know, if the manufacturer is in Germany, you know, what happens to its product at the end of life really varies. You know, in the UK, we do make particle board from it. You saw that. The Danish one, they do too, but in Germany they don't make particle board out of recycled timber. They burn it for energy.
They burn it. Right.
And the benefit of that varies. So just because an EPD provides you with information for the factory gate doesn't, as I say, doesn't mean you use it. You can take it into account. It might be useful, but you shouldn't use it just because it's there. You need to read what the scenario says. Check it's appropriate for your building. And I think often manufacturers don't provide data because they're worried that people will just use it without thinking about it.
Yeah, I could see how that would so easily happen. You just want a quick answer, don't you?
And what we're doing with the digital EPD is trying to make that process of being able to provide more options much easier, so that rather than the EPD providing the data for a thing, it provides information that you can use to generate what it should be.
Yeah. Okay. Fair enough. All right. So, quick question from Catherine Nixon. So, what are the incentives for manufacturers to produce EPDs?
Effectively, I mean, so if you're confident that your product has environmental benefits and advantages, then the EPD will show those. And I think we're starting now to see a really strong interest, particularly in embodied carbon and upfront carbon. So I think people will start to actually look at products and be specifying products and procuring products on the basis of their impacts. And so if you have an EPD that shows your product has a benefit, then people will start using it to procure your product. If you don't have an EPD, they're not going to buy your product because it's got an environmental advantage, because they don't know that. Of course, your EPD might show that your product doesn't have an environmental advantage, and then people won't buy it. So that there is that. But if you've done lots of things, you look at the impact of other manufacturers, you look at what they're telling you about how they make their product, the energy that they use, you might be able to get an idea. And if you talk to an LCA consultant, they should be able to help you get an understanding of what your EPD might say, if that's a concern.
Well, okay, thanks. So we had a quick poll there from manufacturers, quite an interesting spread, really. So yes, we have EPD for many products, seems to have come out top. But of course, there's still that no, we haven't considered EPD for our products at all. So there's a broad range there of responses. Interesting. Richard, have we got another one? So suppliers with published EPD. So questions for architects and specifiers in the audience. So do you refer to EPD on your projects? So we've got always, occasionally, and never. So perhaps we can ask you just to fill in that last poll. And whilst that's happening, Jane, we've got a last question from Cypron, who's saying, should builders work more with natural materials given the larger capacity for sequestering carbon? So I suppose the short answer is yes, but
yeah. I mean, you need to look at the other impacts. So just because a product is natural doesn't mean it's a good product.
Right.
It quite possibly is, and lots of natural products are, but it isn't a universal thing. So as an example, it's not particularly construction related, but the fabric that's made out of bamboo uses lots of energy, lots of chemicals, and lots of water to produce it. So although it's a great renewable material, bamboo fabric is not, when they do comparisons, it generally uses more energy and more water and has a higher impact than other natural materials and things like polyester or whatever kind of
man-made fibers. Yeah. Interesting.
So it isn't that, you know, it's not a kind of tick box. That's it. It's fine. I've checked. It's natural. I can use it. You should look at the EPD and what it tells you.
Okay. Well, we've got an interesting array of responses. So from we've never referred to EPD, seems to have taken the top sort of position for this poll. But there's some people that always refer to them and some occasionally. So it just shows that we're all on a journey, doesn't it? And you know, EPD and spreading the knowledge about EPD is part of what we're trying to do. So hopefully if we do this in a few years' time, we'll see a slightly different result. But yeah, well, I think we should call proceedings to a close. I make it 12:30. So it's been a pretty intensive session. So thanks for rattling through that at a fair pace, Jane. And thank you to the audience for hanging on in there and strapping in for the ride. Jenny, you're from Varston, aren't you? So I'd quite like to have a conversation with you offline about combustible products. So I'll drop you a note. So I've been meaning to try and do that. So brilliant. Thanks, everybody. And we look forward to seeing you for our next event. Don't forget to sign up for our newsletter to keep informed of what we're up to. And we look forward to seeing you next time. So thank you.
And if you do have questions, just drop me an email. That's fine. I'll try and answer them.
Thank you, Jane. That's very generous of you. Thank you.